In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. We're joined by our old friend Michael Lee today, an accomplished author, part-time professor, and tireless advocate for storytelling as a tool for change. For over 2 decades, Michael's passion has driven a remarkable career in LGBTQ+ and HIV/AIDS organizing, human services research, writing, and teaching. Based in Minneapolis, he's spent more than 10 years teaching graduate courses at St. Mary's University of Minnesota, all while excelling as a professional grant writer. Michael's deep interest in the pioneering journalist Randy Shilts led to his writing the acclaimed book When the Band Played On, The Life of Randy Shilts, America's Trailblazing Gay Journalist. Michael Lee, welcome to the program.
Thanks for inviting me, Terry.
You are always juggling a ton of projects. What made you decide to take on a biography?
Because I couldn't believe it hadn't been written. So I was halfway through my PhD program at the University of Minnesota, and I had worked for a number of years in AIDS organizations and took a strong interest in their formation, their history, their culture, because they're really unique places to work. And so I was taking a look at the history behind AIDS organizations in the 1980s, which everybody had talked about as coming out of the gay activist tradition of the 1970s. And as part of that research, I was in the archives at University of Minnesota looking at old issues of The Advocate, which back in the 1970s was kind of the national gay newspaper of record for the gay community. Still around today in an online format. It's one of the standard bearers for LGBTQ journalism. But around about 1975, 1976, as I was looking at all of these concerns that would have informed gay and lesbian community services of that time, I kept finding all of these articles being written by this freelance journalist, Randy Shilts, who I knew from his later work, because Randy Shilts wrote 3, to this day, influential volumes of 20th century gay history. The biography of Harvey Milk, the mayor of Castro Street is that one, and The Band Played On, which is his most famous work about the early years of the AIDS epidemic, and then Conduct Unbecoming, which is the whole story of the U.S. military's persecution of gay and lesbian service members. So I was finding Randy in the mid-'70s writing these pieces about pandemic-level conditions of alcoholism, drug abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, social isolation, loneliness, all the factors that we in the human services later recognized as the comorbidities around AIDS. And here he was in the mid-'70s, a half a decade before the CDC started reporting on these mysterious illnesses. Here he was reporting on the social disease of HIV before anybody knew that this new pandemic was already here. And I was just struck by that. So I made the decision, which anyone who does a PhD will tell you is madness. I made the decision to start my next project before I'd even started my dissertation. And I did that intentionally. I did not want to make this my dissertation. I wanted it to be written for a mass market audience. I knew Randy had, touched the world and shocked the world in all these amazing ways with his journalism, and had really brought aspects of the gay experience to the American public and the American mainstream in ways that no one had managed to do before. So I didn't want this to just be a scholarly exercise. I didn't want to write for other academics. And in fact, someone else, Dr. Andrew Stoner, actually wrote the academic biography of Randy in the same time I was developing this. So we had different audiences, different purposes. Unfortunately, he passed away, but his book was published in 2019. Mine is much more sort of digging into the intimate story of Randy's life, the chronology from birth to his passing. He died from AIDS in 1994. And I just thought this is too important of a story to not be told. And there was a certain urgency to doing that, because at that point, Randy had been gone for 20 years, now 30, and the people who knew him weren't getting any younger either. And so I really set about, between my archival research and my interviews, I ended up doing over 70 oral history interviews with people who knew him, from 2015 to 2022, and with a good chunk of those being during COVID lockdown as well. And people were just really accommodating and generous with their time and their experiences, and sharing with me some really hard stories and some really hard emotions. because especially anybody who lost someone during that period in the 80s when AIDS was a death sentence remembers just how hard it was to make sense of all of that. And I'm really grateful for how people just gave from the heart to help me write this book. So it was a bit of I don't want to call it a fool's errand because it's paying off quite nicely right now. But when you set off to do something like this, you don't know how it's going to be received. You don't know how it could just be one little drop in the ocean. But thankfully, I'm just really grateful that it's being received in the way that it's been intended. And that's been a real blessing. Anytime
you take on a biography, there are hundreds of threads you have to tie together into a cogent narrative. How did you pull it off?
With the biography, what helps is that you have a starting point. There is a natural chronology that's built into it. And you can write a biology that is not chronological. I mean, certain, especially academic biographies, are more sort of theme-based. But I really wanted to go back to this kid his parents were from Michigan. He was raised in Aurora, Illinois, came from a working-class family, came from a household where he had a difficult relationship with his mother. She was very unhappy. She was a heavy drinker, and she was quite abusive, physically abusive. And I just wanted to take that kid's story and see how it would help us to understand him later as a journalist. Because, and I think this is where having a background in, the human services has really helped, is that we recognize stages of development. We recognize that a person is not just existing in a vacuum at any given time, that you and I are each an accumulation of our lived experiences. And so I really wanted to put those pieces together from as early in his childhood as I could through the end of his life. Now, when you take a look at somebody's archives and when you go around and interview people, you're not necessarily getting those puzzle pieces in the exact order. But that was really helpful for me to just be able to see, where does that fit into the life of this person who was born in 1951 and died in 1994? How does this relate? And then when you see pieces come together and say, oh, he did this in 1985, but that comes after this experience in 84. You can see the connections, or some of the statements that he was making even as early as 1979, where you take them out of context and they seem a little disjointed until you look at what happened on either side of that. And then, yes, the puzzle pieces come together, and it's really enjoyable to have that experience. I years ago, I saw myself as an aspiring novelist, potentially, or a poet, or any of those things. And I found myself in the nonfiction lane. And specifically, what's fun with biography is there is this sense of putting together this very intricate, very ornate portraiture of a person's life. And to have that, to have the honor of being Randy's biographer is something that'll sit with me the rest of my life in a very positive way.
Michael Lee is our guest. He's the author of When the Band Played On, The Life of Randy Shilts, America's Trailblazing Gay Journalist. His website is authormglee.com. The book is getting a lot of traction and a lot of media coverage. What do you think drives the interest?
I'm going to tell you an interesting story, and this happens so frequently that I've almost looked at friends and said, see, when this happens. So going back to when I first started researching Randy's life, and I would run into people, particularly if they were, say, 40 or older. And if they asked who I was writing a book about, if I said Randy Shilts, most of the time they go, who? And if I said he was the author of And the Band Played On, immediately there would be this spark, there would be this recognition, and then, Terry, more often than not, more than half the time, someone would start telling me a story about somebody in their life. I heard about the roommate in New York in 1983 that somebody took care of as he was getting sick and dying. I heard about the uncle who left the priesthood to marry a woman and then later moved in with his male partner. And the last time that this person saw him, he had lesions on his face. I heard about the cousin whose funeral someone wasn't allowed to go to. And, most recently in the middle of my book tour, when somebody, not at a book event, at a bar, when she asked me what the book I wrote about, when I showed her the cover, she went, I've got to believe it. Holy bleep it like that. And she started telling me a story. She was about my age, about being in college in the early 90s and how her best friend, who could not come out to anybody in his life, but had come out to her, told her that he had gotten tested and had tested positive. And so the Randy Shilts story, and I think the power of what he did with his journalism, as controversial as it could be at times, is he gave people a way of connecting to their own grief, their own loss, and their own relationships in a way that gave them the sense of injustice that this loved one had experienced. And 100% of the time, this was, people would tell me about somebody they still missed in their life, somebody who still resonated with them. And so I think that reading his story connects people back to a story of somebody meaningful to them that they lost to this pandemic. And I always believe that would be the power of selling this book, is the power of those relationships. And I think that's holding up quite true today in terms of the book's success.
How did writing this book impact you, both as an author and as a person?
Oh, my goodness. In so many ways. I mean, to be entrusted with that, it's the word I'll use again. It's an honor. There are moments where I would spend 6 hours over a kitchen table with somebody, and we would have to take sort of long pauses and collect ourselves. The main piece that I would say that it took away from me is that it really deepened my relationships with the people who agreed to talk to me. And those are relationships that will be with me for the rest of my life, and I'm honored by that. So, at that level, it changes the composition of your circle of intimates. And I love that. In other ways, it just gives me a real appreciation for the trauma that people went through during that time. And also, I think what's important to recognize too is that for a lot of people, this was occurring outside of the mainstream because the press was not covering this beyond. There's this medical oddity that's affecting homosexual men, and oh my goodness, what are it would sort of be distanced, and we'd see news stories with doctors in lab coats and skeletal looking gay men dying in hospital beds. And there is much more to that story that Randy worked really hard to tell, and it's not surprising that many of those traumas still live in the people who survived. And to bear witness to that is a very powerful experience, and to give voice to Randy's experience among all of those people that we lost, I think is really powerful. And again, it's humbling to be the keeper of that, and to get to share it in this really meaningful way.
Growing up, how did your sense of self evolve?
Well, let's keep it with respect to the AIDS epidemic for a minute, because I'm Generation X. And, without a doubt, I can recall as a small child not knowing who I was as a queer person, hearing some of these first mysterious stories of mysterious illnesses affecting this particular community, and having some sort of internalized paranoia or fear or terror even that somehow I might have this. Not that I had done anything that would put me, at risk, but just that there was such a synonymous connection made between gay and AIDS. And I would say that most certainly impacted my development as a kid in the 80s. And I've heard that story many times from people my age, that for our generation, which sort of came, after that wave hit the generation ahead of us, that there was just something that about the very idea of that disease that lived under your skin, even if you didn't know who you were yet. And I think that took a lot of time and work to work through that, with people who have been influential in my life, to be able to live openly, confidently, and extend to others the compassion that I would like to receive as well. And so I think from an early age that idea of that disease was sort of a specter that sat with me and my peers in a way that I think obviously influences my work today, because I went ahead and did this book. But I think is maybe generationally unique because, it was 15 uninterrupted years before we had medications that could save people's lives. So the generation that came after mine yes, HIV was still scary, but there were meds you could take. It wasn't a fatal disease like it was for children my age. And so I just think that so much of my early development was influenced by this scary, mysterious thing happening off in the distance that, the closer I got to it as, a young activist and then a professional in the field, was that it wasn't always representative of the human side of the HIV community, which, continues to battle stigma and educate and make people aware of how they can protect themselves and protect others. And, that's still an ongoing battle to this day. But like I said, coming from where I did, we had 15 uninterrupted years of death. And there's no way that didn't impact my development. And in many ways, it was its own sort of secondary trauma. It also, I would say, probably fostered a sense of resilience that has carried me through on projects like this to the current day.
You've been a change agent for most of your adult life, and that really took off when you got to college.
You and I share a common alma mater, Michigan State University, and I was blessed with the experience. It's something that I took the initiative on myself, but I started the first queer publication at Michigan State. It was called the Q News. It was in the late 90s, and our emphasis was that people's own stories were newsworthy. And what we saw happen on that campus during that period was this sort of blossoming of new activism that sort of went from being very sort of small and centralized in the Student Alliance that still exists to this day to being diffused out to that massive residence hall system that Michigan State has. And, where all of the residence hall systems develop these caucuses to be able to connect people in their own neighborhoods. So in the midst of that happening, here comes the Q News. So not only were people finding and having meetings and organizing in their own residence hall complexes, but here was this magazine showing their peers' lives and experiences to each other. And being the facilitator of that was really empowering for me. And I think that experience was both a piece that gave me, one, confidence in my own ability as a writer and speaker and someone who could tell stories and tell my story, but also as someone who is in service to the community as well, and really understanding servant leadership from the standpoint of creating a platform where others' voices are raised up. And to that point, something I'm deeply proud of is one of my fellow Michigan State alums is Rachel Crandall Crocker, the founder of Transgender Day of Visibility, who was at the time an activist in the Lansing area who came to me and asked if she could write for our magazine, and she did. And I had no idea at the time that she was so newly out as a trans person, and now has become this figure in a global movement to celebrate and embrace our trans loved ones. And so the people you meet along the way, you never know where they're going to take and use that platform and those gifts and those skills. But to be able to offer space for someone like Rachel, who became a dear friend and is still to this day, to be able to offer her that space was really meaningful. And so some really profound things were happening that I got to participate in and be a leader, even as I was doing my part to try to amplify the voices around me. And I just found that to be such a moving experience, because it wasn't a sense of me moving onto a platform for myself. It was bringing everybody with me who wanted to participate in that, so that the voices truly were of the community. And I'll be forever grateful for that experience, and for the mentors who nurtured my activism during that time and gave me sometimes really hard feedback that I was able to use to continue to improve myself and improve the magazine, and to give people the experience of speaking their truth, speaking their lives.
And you went on to become president of the Michigan State University LGBTQ alumni.
For a long time. No one else wanted to do it for a period in there. So
it's true.
But But those are hard things to step up for. We did keep that going for a long time, and I hope in whatever form it takes in the present day, I hope that is able to be nurtured. I've been a bit busy the last few years, so.
How did you juggle writing the book and completing a PhD?
Well, the PhD came first, and I started. So I had the idea in 2012. In fact, I still had to do all of my written exams later that fall, and then did my oral exams in 2013. Did not do my first research or research trip until 2014, and that was literally 1 week in San Francisco over spring break. And then I had to set it aside because I was finishing my dissertation. So the following year, I was getting close to defending, made a couple more trips to San Francisco in that period. And then once I graduated, summer of 2015, I made this my project and continued doing things that I was already doing to support myself, namely teaching part-time as an adjunct professor and also building a small business for myself as a professional grant writer. And between that and buying my insurance through the ACA, through the health exchange, was able to make it work so that I could juggle the different projects and also work remotely. So I could be anywhere, especially for a lot of my teaching. Thankfully, with online teaching these days, a professor can be halfway across the country. And if they're still answering emails and grading papers and, getting on Zoom with their students, they can, they can do their job. So, it has been a bit of sort of high level multitasking to make this work. But it also added a sense of exhilaration to it. Anytime I would get an email back from somebody who was interested in agreeing to an interview with me, it was just sort of this thrill that, I'm going to get to talk to so-and-so. I'm going to get to talk to so-and-so, and some really high profile people did talk to me for this book. And I'm grateful for their time and their enthusiasm for it. So, but on any given day, my life could look very different, whether it was grading papers or being in the classroom, working on state or federal grant proposals, or flying to San Francisco or New York or somewhere to do interviews. It was just, it really kept me on my toes as far as being in touch with my calendar and what I needed to get done.
Your life has never been boring, Michael. What do you hope the impact of this book will be over time?
Well, one, Randy's story has finally been told. And as an addendum to his 3 books, I think that it provides a really important context and chronology for his legacy. I think it brings another dimension to what is known about the history of LGBTQ movements in the U.S., as well as the HIV/AIDS pandemic. I think that also it's just a damn good story. And I'm not just talking about how I wrote it, but I'm talking about Randy's life itself. From very early on, before I even started the book proposal, I could see there were these sort of natural dramatic peaks in his life that lent itself to writing a book that almost had that feel of being a novel, and giving people that sense of emotional connection, I think, is important as well. That this is someone's lived experience, and we don't just experience someone's life through sort of a distanced, cold, analytical, sort of intellectualizing. That there is this core experience to it that hits right in the gut. And if people can feel what it must have felt like to be Randy Shilts, then I think I've given them a fairly strong sense of his legacy, both as the journalist that he was, but also the whole person that he was. And I like that this piece will live on for me beyond my time, but also that it will connect back to someone who really was making history as he was reporting on it. And I think that continues to be paramount for us to preserve those histories and that legacy as we move ahead through whatever times are ahead for us. But, that he lived, he contributed substantially, and the movements are in a very different place today, and in part because of what he did. And so I think that legacy has been cemented a bit.
What's on the horizon for Michael Lee?
Well, I mentioned my friend Rachel, And she and I have talked about and started to lay the groundwork for a book about her life, which will be a collaboration. And I'm very proud of that. This is something that she reached out to me to ask if I was interested in doing, and I certainly am. Transgender Day of Visibility is a global phenomenon now, and she is, in my mind, the embodiment of servant leadership, because what she's been doing in Michigan for 26, 27 years has really changed communities and changed lives for the better. And so to see what she has done at that level, that she then connected to this global movement of transgender visibility, is remarkable. As well as Rachel, she self-describes as a Jewish transgender lesbian with Tourette's syndrome. I mean, you want to talk about intersectionality, and you want to talk about like all sort of the weaving, and especially around identity, disability, all of those pieces. We've already recorded the oral history for it, so I've been a little busy. But that's going to be the next book proposal. And I'm just really excited to work with her on that, because it's a story that also needs to be told. And having been her friend for, my gosh, it's 26 or 27 years now. I think 27 years. I'm just honored. I'm just humbled that she would ask me to share that role with her. So we'll be continuing to tell these real, vivid, visceral stories of people's lives who have changed the world for the better. And I just am happy to stay in that lane, because it's just such a rich and vibrant one. Sometimes the truth really is more interesting than fiction. Not that there aren't great works of fiction out there and great fiction authors, but my gosh, true stories sometimes just have you amazed at what people can accomplish. So,
well, you did a terrific job in telling Randy's story in a way that I think will appeal to every audience.
I hope people come to it with an open mind and an open heart. If you are not part of the LGBTQ community, you'll learn things that you maybe didn't know before. And I think the same is true if you are a member of the LGBTQ community. There are facets and insights, and I would say nuances to Randy's lived experiences that people can connect with, regardless of how they identify in their own lives or in their own worlds. So I just hope people will continue to receive it in the way that it's intended.
The book is When the Band Played On, The Life of Randy Shilts, America's Trailblazing Gay Journalist. His website is authormglee.com. Michael, it's great to catch up with you again. Thanks very much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me. I am so grateful to have this conversation with you.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.